1970, a hiker in Norway stumbled upon a charred body hidden in the remote ice valley. Every label has been carefully cut from her clothes. Her passport was gone. Her fingerprints were scrubbed, and her luggage contained coded notebooks and wigs. Decades later, DNA reveals she was an elite operative moving across Europe under a dozen fake identities until someone silenced her forever. Who was the Isdal Woman? Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Isdal Woman. Chapter 1. Death Valley. There is a valley outside the city of Bergen, Norway, that locals have called Isdalen for centuries. Death Valley. Not because of anything dramatic that happened there in living memory, but because the land itself seemed to hold something heavy. A reputation built across generations, across suicides in the Middle Ages, across hiking accidents on its steep and uneven terrain, across the way the shadow falls when the sun drops behind Ulriken, the tallest of the 7 mountains that ring the city from above. Ulriken is a mountain that dominates the eastern horizon of Bergen, rising to just under 650 meters. The city sits below it like something cupped in a hand, sheltered by mountains on nearly every side, open to the water on the west, the broad Byfjord that leads out to the North Sea. Bergen is one of the oldest cities in Norway, founded around 1070, and for centuries it was the country's most important trading hub, the home base of the Hanseatic merchants who came down from the great German ports to buy and sell dried fish, timber, and cloth. The city's wooden buildings, its winding harbor streets, its layers of history, compressed into a relatively compact geography. All of this gives it a particular character. It is beautiful and a little melancholy, often damp from the heavy rainfall that the surrounding mountain trap and concentrates there. Bergen is said to be one of the rainiest cities in Europe, and locals have largely made their peace with this. At the northern face of Ulriken, a glacial carved valley opens between stone and pine. That is Isdalen, the ice valley, named for the great icicles that hang from the branches of its tall trees in winter, for the way the cold pools there and stays. It is a popular hiking trail, even in bad weather. The path is well worn. Families go there on Sunday mornings. In summer, it is genuinely lovely. The tall pines filtering the light, the rocky terrain giving way to small clearings, the sound of the city falling away below. But in November, when the light disappears early and the temperature drops sharply and the wind comes down off the mountain with nothing to stop it, the valley becomes something else, a quiet wilderness, indifferent to human presence, just a few miles from the second largest city in Norway. It was into this valley that a family walked on the morning of November 29, 1970, a Sunday, clear and cold. A professor and his 2 young daughters taking a morning hike in the foothills before the day closed in. The path they were following was familiar to anyone who walked these hills regularly. The scree fields, those loose collections of broken rock that collect at the base of slopes, were normal features of the landscape. So it was not immediately alarming when they noticed an odd smell drifting through the cold air. A burning smell. Old, not fresh. The kind of smell that lingers after a fire has gone out. What the daughters found in small hollow among the rocks, tucked into a depression in the scree on the lower slope, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And it would stay with Norway, and with anyone who has ever spent time in this case, in the particular way that unresolved things stay, not as a memory that fades, but as a question that persists. The body of a woman lying on her back, her head pointed downhill, her front badly burned, her face unrecognizable, most of her hair gone, her arm raised near her torso, her arms drawn up toward her chest, fists curled inward, elbows bent. What forensic pathologists will later identify as a pugilistic pose, the instinctive contraction of muscles that happens when the body is subjected to extreme heat. The tendons shortens, the limbs pulled inward. It is not a position of violence. It is a position of physics, of what fire does to the human body. But it looked to anyone who encountered it in that clearing like a woman with her guard up, like someone who never quite stopped fighting. The family descended to Bergen and reported what they had found. The police arrived at the scene within hours. Chapter 2. What was left behind? The objects the police found at the scene and the ones they found in the days after tell a story, or rather the beginning of several stories that have never quite resolved into one. At the scene itself, scattered around and near the body on that rocky slope, a watch, whose position had survived the fire in a way that struck investigators as odd, though the specifics have never been fully clarified in the public record. 2 earrings and a ring, an umbrella, badly damaged by the fire, a small purse and a matchbox, an empty bottle of St. Helvard's liquor, a Norwegian spirit produced since the 1960s from blend of herbs, spices, and honey, 2 plastic water bottles, a plastic holder of the type used for passports, rubber boots, a woolen jumper, a scarf, nylon stockings, the kind of clothing you might bring for a Norwegian autumn, laid out or scattered as though they had been set down or dropped. Around the body were the remnants of burned paper, unreadable, destroyed, and beneath the body itself, pressed under her, was a fur hat. The fur hat had traces of petrol on it. 12 sleeping pills were found lying in the dirt and among the rocks near the body. Every single identifying mark had been removed from every item at the scene. The clothing labels were gone, not worn away but deliberately cut out. The brand names on the bottles had been scraped off. The serial number on the watch were gone. The maker's mark on the jewelry had been filed away. Any information that might have pointed to where these things were manufactured, purchased, or sold had been erased with a thoroughness that takes time and intention, and a particular awareness of the ways in which material objects can become trails. If someone wanted to set a body on fire, a hat placed beneath it would absorb the accelerants before it evaporated, serving as tinder to ensure the fire would catch and sustain. Someone brought petrol to this remote place and poured it here with purpose. Whether that someone was the woman herself or another person, or both, is one of the questions that has never been answered. 3 days after the discovery of the body, station staff at Bergen railway station opened the coin-operated left luggage locker, whose rental period had expired. Inside were 2 suitcases. The locker had a deposit record, a timestamp showing when the bags had been checked in, and that record gave investigators their first concrete thread to pull. The bags had been deposited on November 23rd, a Monday. That date meant something immediately, because police had already been interviewing hotel staff across Bergen, and the staff at the Hotel Hordeheimen had told them that a foreign woman, matching the description of the dead woman, had checked out of room 407 on exactly that date, paid in cash, and asked for a taxi. 2 separate records, the locker deposit and the hotel checkout, now pointed to the same Monday morning. To check whether that alignment was coincidence or confirmation, investigators turned to the coded notebook found inside the suitcases. They had already begun decoding it, and the travelogue entries used a consistent abbreviation system. M for month, O for Oslo, B for Bergen. Working through these entries, they found 23N, which read alongside the surrounding pattern, could only mean November 23rd. 3 independent sources, the locker timestamp, the hotel register, and the notebook entry had converged on the same date without any of them referencing the others. That convergence placed her at Bergen railway station on the morning of November 23rd, 6 days before her body was found in the valley above the city. When investigators opened the bags and went through the contents, they found a pair of sunglasses. An officer held them up in the light and saw a partial fingerprint on the lens. Here the sources diverge. Some accounts say the print was matched to the body, linking the suitcases directly to the dead woman. Others say her fingertips had been too badly burned to yield usable prints at the scene, and several sources state they had been deliberately sanded beforehand, which would make any match to the body impossible. What most accounts agree on is that the print from the sunglasses matched a print on the non-prescription glasses in the same bag, establishing that one person had handled both items. Whether that person was the woman in the valley was then a matter of inference rather than forensic proof, supported by the converging dates, the physical description, the hotel trail, but not conclusively established by fingerprint evidence alone. Inside those suitcases was a carefully constructed life designed to reveal nothing. Clothing with all labels removed, multiple changes of outfit suggesting a woman prepared to alter her appearance substantially, shoes, multiple wigs in different styles and color, makeup and cosmetics, non-prescription glasses, offering no vision correction, purchased purely as props to change her appearance to an observer, passport photographs showing her in different disguises, not just different wigs, but different full presentations, the kind of preparation you do when you need to support multiple travel documents rather than simply change how you look on a given day. Eczema cream with the prescribing doctor's name in the pharmacy scraped off. Even her medication was anonymous. A small collection of coins, Belgian francs, British pounds, Swiss francs, 135 Norwegian kroner in cash, maps of Norway, some with locations marked in pen, train and ferry timetables, a spoon with what appeared to have been a monogram filed smooth, and hidden in the lining of one suitcase, folded and pressed flat, 5 100 Deutschmark banknotes, German currency worth approximately 137 American dollars in 1970, close to $1,000 in today's terms, enough to travel, to eat, to stay in hotels for a week or more, without drawing on other funds. Cash hidden in a lining is the choice of a person who expected to be searched. There was also a notepad. It contained entry written in a code, a simple substitution cipher that investigators decoded without great difficulty. What it revealed was a travelogue, dates and places, recording where the woman had been, cities, dates of arrival and departure, arranged in the sparse and factual way a person record obligation rather than experiences. What the code did not reveal, and what has never been extracted from those pages, was why. Why those cities? Why those dates? Who was she meeting? What she was doing in each place? The notebook recorded movement without motive, presence without purpose. A map that showed the road but not the destination. Chapter 3. 8 names, 8 lives. Using the hotel registration forms that Norwegian hotels were legally required to maintain, investigators traced the woman's movements through the country. The woman had been checking into hotels under false names. Not one false name, not 2 or 3, at least 8 different identities, each with its own carefully invented Belgian address, each listing her as a Belgian national, each filled out in either French or German, but apparently never in her native language, whatever that was. The addresses she gave were almost all fictitious, Belgium street names that sounded plausible, Brussels neighborhoods with a ring of authenticity, but when investigators checked them against real maps and directories, the streets either did not exist or the specific addresses did not correspond to any actual buildings. The single exception was Rue de la Madeleine in Brussels, which exists. The rest were constructions. Her names: Genevieve Lancière from Leuven, Claudia Tilt from Brussels, used at 2 different hotels with 2 different invented addresses. Claudia Nelson from Ghent, Alexia Zarne Merchez from Ljubljana, in what is now Slovenia, making this the one alias that departs from the exclusively Belgian pattern. Vera Jarl from Antwerp, Fenella Lork, address lost. Elizabeth Lienhauer from Austin. 8 identities, all with Belgian nationality, all filled in with the same handwriting. When police examined those hotel registration forms and compared them against each other, the consistency was immediate and striking. They sent samples to a handwriting analyst, who concluded that the script showed characteristic consistent with someone educated in France or a French-speaking environment. The particular way certain letters were formed, the rhythms of the pen, the small habits that schooling leaves in handwriting, and that survives even when someone is writing under a false name. The consistency across the aliases told investigators these were not impulsive inventions made on the spot at hotel front desk. They were prepared. She arrived at each hotel knowing what name she would use, what address she would give, what story she would tell. She described herself to hotel staff as traveling salesman, or in some occasions as an antique dealer. These are cover occupations with explanatory power. A traveling saleswoman would naturally move between cities, travel by train, stay in hotels, carry money, and have no fixed local base. No one would find it odd that such a person came and went without leaving deep social roots. The same is true of an antiquities dealer, someone who traveled circuits through Europe's auction houses and estate sales, buying and selling portable luxury goods for cash. Both covers were well chosen. Staff at various hotels gave consistent physical descriptions. She was attractive in a way that was not flashy, but precise, well put together. Approximately 164 centimeters tall, slender, with broad hips, according to one description. Dark brown hair, which was often a wig. A small round face, small brown eyes. Well dressed in the European continental style of the era. Fashionable, but not ostentatious. She kept mailing to her room. When she moved through communal spaces, dining rooms and lobbies, she positioned herself with her back to walls and her face toward entrances. She requested rooms with views of the parking lot or lobby. Several staff at different hotels remembered her asking to switch rooms after her initial assignment, always seeking the position with the clearest sightline to whoever might be arriving. She always paid cash. In 1970, this was common enough not to raise immediate alarm, but in retrospect, it was part of a consistent pattern of avoiding financial traces. She smelled of garlic or strong spices or perfume, depending on who recalled her. A detail so specific that it lodges in the memory, the sensory impression left by someone who otherwise worked so hard to leave no impression at all. She spoke German fluently. One witness overheard her in conversation with a man in German at a Bergen hotel. She also spoke Flemish, a Dutch dialect of northern Belgium, which was consistent with her Belgium cover identity and may have been a language she grew up with. Her English was reportedly broken and hesitant, though the quality of her English matters less than the fluency of her German and her French, because those were the languages of her check-in forms. Her written communications, the world she apparently moved through. On at least one occasion, a waitress at the Neptun Hotel in Bergen remembered her dining near 2 men from the German Navy, including an officer. Whether she was seated next to them by coincidence or arrangement, whether she knew them or was observing them, or was simply sharing a dining room with strangers who happened to be in the military, has never been established. Her reconstructed itinerary pieced together across the hotel records is as follows. In the spring of 1970, beginning in late March, She checked into the Viking Hotel in Oslo as Genevieve Lancier. 3 days later, she was in Bergen at the Hotel Bristol, registered as Claudia Tilt. A day after that, she moved to Hotel Scandia, also in Bergen, under the same alias, and stayed there through the end of March and into early April. Then she disappeared from the Norwegian record for approximately 6 months. She reappeared in October 1970 in Stavanger, the oil city on Norway's southwestern coast, about a 3-hour drive south of Bergen. Stavanger in 1970 was beginning the transformation that would make it the center of the Norwegian petroleum industry, the North Sea oil boom just getting underway. But it was also a military and naval port. She checked in as Claudia Nelson at the KNA Hotellet on October 29th, stayed one night, and was in Bergen the following day as Alexia Zarna Merchis at the Neptun Hotel. Her final hotel registration was at the Hotel Hordeheimen in Bergen. Hotel staff told investigators she stayed there from November 19th to November 23rd, checked out on that Monday, paid in cash, and asked for a taxi. She was found 6 days later on the hillside above the city. What happened in those 6 days is not known. Where she went, who she was with, whether she was trying to leave Bergen or already in the valley, whether she was alive and mobile until the final moments, or whether something happened in those intervening days that changed everything. 6 days erased. One of the central silences of the case. Chapter 4. The Valley in the Cold War. By the time investigators had worked through the hotel records, decoded the notebook, and begun tracing the aliases across Bergen and Stavanger, it was clear this was not going to be a routine case. The Bergen police, a city force, not accustomed to cases of this complexity, requested assistance from Kripos, the Norwegian Criminal Investigation Service, the national body brought in for major crimes. Nearly 100 witnesses were eventually interviewed. The investigation became one of the most expensive in Norwegian police history to that point, and yet, within 3 months of the body being found, the case was formally closed. No identification, no named suspect. A verdict of probable suicide delivered at a press conference on December 21, 1970, that satisfied almost no one who had actually worked on it. To understand why the case escalated the way it did within the Norwegian security apparatus, and why it was closed so quickly despite so many unanswered questions, you need to understand where Norway sat in the world in 1970. The Cold War was not a metaphor in Norway. It was a physical fact of daily life. Norway shared a 196-kilometer land border with the Soviet Union above the Arctic Circle. In the Finnmark region, one of the few places on Earth where a NATO member state literally shares a frontier with Soviet territory. Norwegian soldier and Soviet soldier could and sometimes did observe each other at close range across that line. Bergen on the western coast was not close to that border geographically, but it was strategically essential. It was home to one of Norway's most significant naval bases, the fjord of western Norway. Those long, narrow, glacier-carved sea inlets reaching deep into the landscape had been important military geography since the Second World War, when German forces used them as shelter bases for their surface fleet, including the battleship Tirpitz. In the Cold War era, the fjords were important to the Soviet Navy for the same reasons: deep water, protected anchorage, access to the Atlantic. Soviet submarines were a constant presence in and around Norwegian fjords throughout this period. The Norwegian military tracked them. NATO forces tracked them. Sometimes they were found. More often than Norwegian authorities like to admit, they were not. The acoustic signatures of Soviet subs became a kind of background music to Norwegian naval operations, a low drone underlying everything. Norway had been a founding member of NATO in 1949, but it maintained a particular kind of membership that distinguished it from many other alliance members. In a bilateral agreement with the Soviet Union, Norway had promised not to allow foreign troops to be permanently stationed on its soil during peacetime, meant to reduce tension at the northern frontier, to reassure Moscow that Norway was not positioning itself as a forward base for any aggressive NATO posture. In practice, this placed Norway in an unusual position, fully integrated into Western alliances' command and intelligence structure, committed to the collective defense of Europe, but also with an ongoing interest in not provoking the neighbor to the northeast. This ambiguity was in its own way both an intelligence asset and a liability simultaneously. And into this context enters the Penguin missile. The Penguin, officially the Penguin Mark I, was a Norwegian-designed anti-ship missile system developed through the 1960s in collaboration with the United States Navy and West Germany. The goal was a guided missile that could be fired from Norwegian fast patrol boats to strike and sink enemy surface vessels at ranges that would make it very difficult for those vessels to intercept or retaliate. By 1970, the Penguin was in its final stages of testing. It would officially enter service in 1972 as NATO's first operational naval strike missile, a milestone in the technological competition of the Cold War. The tests were conducted along the Norwegian coast in classified exercises whose dates, location, and results were among the most tightly held secrets in the Norwegian military establishment. When investigators traced the Isdal Woman's movement through the hotel records in the coded notebook, they found a correlation that chilled everyone who saw it. Her presence in Bergen in March and early April of 1970 and in Stavanger in late October seemed to correspond in timing and geography with the known locations and approximate dates of Penguin missile tests. A fisherman in Stavanger came forward during the investigation, not to the Bergen police, but directly to a security officer at the Usni naval base. This detail only became known later, when the classified military files were disclosed, revealing that the naval base had been receiving its own stream of tip-offs that never made it into the Bergen police file. The fisherman said he had seen a woman matching the published description of the Isdal Woman in the area where military movements related to the missile tests had been observed. A shoe salesman in Stavanger also confirmed her presence there through a different route. Inside the suitcases found at Bergen railway station, investigators had discovered a plastic shopping bag from Oscar Rortvedt footwear store in Stavanger. When police tracked down the store and spoke to the owner's son, Rolf Rortvedt, he remembered selling rubber boots to a foreign-looking woman who took her time choosing and spoke with an unusual accent. Those boots matched the ones found at the scene of her death. Then the Norwegian Armed Forces declassified a file that had been kept secret from the Bergen police. Dated December 1970, it revealed that the Norwegian military had opened its own parallel investigation into the woman's death, entirely separate from the one being conducted by local police, which the Bergen police knew nothing about. The file showed that the Norwegian Armed Forces commander, a man named Onarheim, had explicitly noted that the woman's movements corresponded to the top-secret Penguin missile trials. Onarheim further noted that Norwegian Defense Research Establishment personnel, the scientists and engineers working on the Penguin system, had stayed at the very same hotels in Stavanger during the missile tests. The Norwegian Intelligence Service had been conducting their own inquiry alongside this. The Bergen police, the military, and the military intelligence were all investigating the same death from different angles, without coordinating and without sharing information. In the Bergen police, the people nominally in charge of the investigation were being kept in the dark about the most sensitive dimension of it. This compartmentalization has never been fully explained. It cannot easily be attributed to coincidence or bureaucratic inertia. It speaks to a deliberate decision made somewhere in the Norwegian security apparatus to treat this woman's death as something more sensitive than a local murder investigation. And what followed from that treatment was the rapid closure of a case that left far too many questions unanswered. Chapter 5. The Official Verdict. On December 21st, 1970, less than a month after the body's discovery, the Bergen police held a press conference. Their conclusion was that the woman had committed suicide by setting fire to herself. There are people who heard that conclusion at the time and believed it. The evidence on its surface could be arranged to support it: a large quantity of sleeping pills in her stomach and a accelerant used to start the fire. In this reading, the woman had taken herself to a remote valley, swallowed a fatal quantity of barbiturates, poured petrol over herself, and struck a match. The investigators who had actually worked the case, for the most part, did not believe it. The lead detective, Oscar Horness, made a point of saying publicly that espionage could be ruled out with certainty. That assertion has puzzled analysts for decades. It came just weeks after the classified military file had documented the correspondence between her movements and the penguin missile test, and it ran directly counter to what the physical evidence at the scene suggested. Whether it reflected Horness's genuine reading of the case or something he had been told to say has never been established. He did not explain his reasoning publicly. Other officers were less circumspect. When journalists and researchers interviewed investigators who had worked the case in the decades that followed, several said versions of the same thing. Very few of them had believed it was suicide. One detective inspector, identified in Norwegian reporting only as AS, was quoted as saying simply, "I do not believe it was suicide." The problem with the suicide verdict assembles from several directions, and most of them come directly from the autopsy that Bergen pathologists concluded in the days after the body was found. Consider the position of the body. She was lying on her back, her head downhill, her arms curled up toward her chest. People who self-immolate typically fall forward or remain upright until they lose consciousness. They do not lie flat on their backs in an orderly position downhill, with their arms pulled inward by heat. The position is consistent with someone already unconscious when the fire began. Consider the petrol under the fur hat. If you are setting yourself on fire, you pour accelerants over yourself. You do not lay a hat on the ground and pour petrol under it, then lie down on top of it. That sequence of events only makes sense if someone else arranged the scene. Consider the soot in the lungs. The autopsy found soot particles deep in her lungs, which could accumulate in a person who is alive and breathing when fire burns in their immediate vicinity. She was alive when the fire was burning, yet analysis of the contents of her stomach showed she had consumed between 50 and 70 phenamyl brand sleeping pills, a phenobarbital barbiturate, and those pills had not been fully absorbed into her bloodstream when she died. She had taken them not long before death, and they had incapacitated her, but not yet killed her. She was alive, but incapacitated when the fire was set. Consider the bruise on her neck. The autopsy noted that it can be explained by a fall in the rocky terrain on her way into the valley, or it could be explained by a blow. It was noted and then effectively set aside by the original investigation. Consider the 12 sleeping pills found near the body. The autopsy had established she had swallowed 50 to 70. If a person takes that many pills and then sets themselves on fire, why are 12 more laying in the dirt beside them? If they had spilled from a container, you would expect them scattered broadly, not lying in a relatively tidy arrangement near a burned and incapacitated body. If someone else administered the pills, some might simply have been left behind. And consider the meticulous removal of every identifying label from every possession. Suicide victims do not, as a rule, spend the hours or days before their death systematically erasing all identifying marks from their clothing and belongings. The label removal speaks to someone who did not want to be identified after death, and the thoroughness of it, not just labels from clothes, but brand names from bottles and the monogram from a spoon, speaks to professional training or, at minimum, professional instruction. The case was formally closed in February 1971. The woman was buried, and the silence settled in. Chapter 6. A Science of Teeth. For 46 years, the case sat in the official record as a closed suicide, but it lived on in Norwegian memory and in the particular subculture of people who found their way to it and could not let it go. There was something about the density of detail, the systematic strangeness of it, the way every thread you pulled seemed to lead to another thread rather than a resolution. In 2016, Norwegian journalist Merit Heigraf persuaded the Bergen police to formally reopen the case. She had made an important discovery. The woman's jawbone, removed during the original autopsy in 1970, along with tissue samples from her organs, had never been buried with the rest of her. The rest of her body was in a zinc coffin in a cemetery, but the jaw, extracted because of distinctive and unusual dental work, and preserved against the possibility that future technology might one day extract useful information from it, was sitting in a forensic archive. A piece of a woman who otherwise existed only as a file number in a photograph. In 1970, Bergen pathologists had had the foresight to preserve what they could. They did not know what future forensic science would be able to do with dental remains, with tissue samples, with bone. But they knew that the woman's teeth were remarkable. Multiple gold crowns of a type and quality unusual in Scandinavia. Extensive root canal work across multiple teeth. A marked gap between the two upper front teeth. And so they kept them. The zinc coffin had been chosen for the same reason, slowing decomposition significantly. These were decisions made by people who suspected this case would remain unresolved, who were acting for a future they could not see. Heigraf's NRK investigation commissioned new artistic reconstructions of the woman's face, created by American artist Stephen Missel, working from the physical descriptions of witnesses and from anthropological analysis of the skull. 6 alternative sketches were produced, circulated, and checked against the memory of people who had seen her. More than 150 tips arrived from the Norwegian public. None produced a confirmed identification. The scientific advance came in 2017, when researchers from the University of Canberra in Australia, led by forensic geochemist Jurian Hufroth, worked with Kripos, the Norwegian Criminal Investigation Service, to apply stable isotope analysis of tooth enamel to the preserved jawbone. It was the first time the technique had been used in a Norwegian criminal investigation. When teeth form, a process that begins before birth and continues through the late teenage years, the enamel incorporates trace amounts of chemical isotopes from the food eaten and water drunk during those years of development. Isotopes are variants of chemical elements with the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. The ratios of different isotopes in a given region vary in characteristic ways, depending on the local bedrock, soil chemistry, and water chemistry. Strontium isotopes are influenced by the age and composition of the underlying geology. Oxygen isotopes in drinking water vary with altitude, latitude, and proximity to the sea. Lead isotopes carry signatures of industrial activity and local mineral deposits. The isotopic ratios locked into tooth enamel during childhood are a chemical fingerprint of the geography of your early life. Because the different layers of a tooth form at different ages, a skilled analyst can read the isotope record the way you would read the rings of a tree. For the Isdal Woman, the results were striking. They indicated she had been born around 1930, plus or minus approximately 4 years. This immediately revised the estimates made in 1970, which had placed her age at 25 to 30. She was not a young woman in her late 20s. She was approximately 40 years old at the time of her death. Her early childhood isotopic signature was consistent with the region around Nuremberg in southeastern Germany, a city in Bavaria famous for its medieval old town, its role as the site of the Nuremberg rallies and later the Nuremberg trials, and its underlying Franconian geology, whose specific characteristics made it identifiable in her earliest tooth development. But the signature shifted in her later dental formation, in the layers corresponding to late childhood and early adolescence. The shift was consistent with a westward relocation, toward France or toward the Franco-German border region. Based on the approximate dating of the tooth layers, the move appeared to have occurred sometime in the late 1930s or during the Second World War. A German-born child growing up near Nuremberg in the years of the Third Reich, relocating westward toward France during the war years. Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s was a place of enormous social disruption. Families moved, were displaced, fled, were evacuated, were killed. The movement of civilians during and after the war was one of the great human catastrophes of the 20th century. A child born near Nuremberg around 1930 would have been about 9 years old when the war began and about 15 when it ended. Those are formative years under any circumstances. They were years that would have shaped everything about who someone became. The analysis of her handwriting, the same handwriting analysis performed on the hotel registration forms back in 1970, which had indicated she was educated in France or a French-speaking environment, was now consistent with the isotopic finding of a westward relocation during childhood. A German girl who moved to France during or just after the war, who received her formal education in a French language environment, who grew up bilingual in ways that left traces in the rhythm of her writing. The DNA analysis added another layer. The DNA Doe Project, an American nonprofit that uses forensic genetic genealogy to identify unknown descendants, made contact with the Death in Ice Valley team and offered assistance. Geneticist Colleen Fitzpatrick, one of the project's founders and one of the leading practitioners in the field, joined the effort. Analysis of the preserved tissue samples established that the woman belonged to mitochondrial haplogroup age 24, a specific lineage of mitochondrial DNA passed exclusively from mother to children, tracing to a matrilineal origin in southeastern Europe or southwestern Asia. Mitochondrial haplogroup tracks the deep ancestry of the maternal line. Age 24 is found predominantly in populations originating in the Balkans, in southeastern Europe, in the areas corresponding to former Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, and parts of Turkey and the Middle East. It is not a Western European haplogroup. It does not typically indicate ancestry from Germany or France or Belgium. It indicates a maternal line, however many generations back from the southeastern European world. This was consistent with several of the witness descriptions. Multiple people who saw or interacted with the woman reported that she seemed in some ways Eastern European. One witness described a Balkan accent. Another recalled her arguing with a man in what sounded like an Eastern European language. And one of her aliases, Alexia Zarna Merche, from Ljubljana, stands out from the rest precisely because Ljubljana is the capital of Slovenia, in the heart of the former Yugoslav world. Whether that alias was chosen because it resonated with something true about her background, or whether it was simply another invented cover, is one of the questions that has never been resolved. Chapter 7. Theories. There are several competing explanations for who the Isdal woman was and how she died. None are proven. The spy theory. The evidence, taken together, presents a surface profile that looks convincingly like a Cold War operative. Multiple false identities with invented addresses, wigs, and disguises, a coded travelogue, movement patterns corresponding to classified military exercises, the interest and parallel investigation of Norwegian military intelligence, the seeming interference of the Tjenesten with the local police investigation, and the suspiciously rapid closure of the official inquiry. Bergen in 1970 was a significant operational environment. Soviet submarines were in the fjord. NATO exercises were in the harbor. The Penguin missile was being tested along the coast. If a foreign intelligence service wanted eyes on what Norway was developing and where it was deploying assets, Bergen and Stavanger were the places to be. Some analysts have suggested the East German Stasi as a candidate rather than the KGB, noting that the Stasi ran extensive European operations using female operatives with non-German cover identities during exactly this period, and that their methods included precisely the kind of rapid identity cycling the Isdal woman employed. The Stasi's foreign intelligence arm, Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, had active networks in Scandinavia throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The Stasi also maintained an unusually close relationship with Palestinian militant groups, a connection that would become significant in other theories. One detail that has attracted particular attention in this context is the passport photographs found in her suitcase. These photographs showed her in disguise, not just wigs, but full alternate presentations. This is consistent with tradecraft, with the preparation of multiple passport photos, identities to support multiple travel documents. It is not something a person inventing cover stories on the fly does for themselves. And there is the matter of the aliases themselves. Some researchers, quoted in reporting around the case, have noted that certain of her alias names appeared in intelligence training scenario documents of the era, names used in instruction materials for recruits learning to construct and maintain false identities. This has never been conclusively demonstrated, but the suggestion that her names were not inventions born from her own imagination, but came from a list, from a handler, from a system. Experienced intelligence analysts have nonetheless raised important objections to the full spy hypothesis. Alexander Vasiliev, a former KGB intelligence officer who became a researcher and author after the Soviet collapse, was consulted during the NRK investigation. His assessment was measured but clear. The behavioral profile of the Isdal woman does not fit a state-sponsored intelligence operative. Field operatives working for state intelligence agencies are given one or at most two carefully constructed false identities, called legends in the tradecraft's vocabulary. A legend is not just a name and address, but a complete false biography, supported by documents, by verifiable history, by backstory that can survive scrutiny. The point of a legend is that it is solid, sustainable, and consistent. A good spy stays in one identity for months or years in a given location, building relationships, establishing routine, becoming part of the local environment. The goal is not to stand out. The Isdal Woman used 8 or 9 identities and cycled through them rapidly, moving between hotels and cities with a frequency that would strike any experienced intelligence handler as operationally reckless. She did not blend in. Hotel staff remembered her. She smelled of garlic. She wore wigs that people noticed. She asked for specific room assignments in ways that were unusual enough to stick in memory. She was a distinctive rather than invisible presence. A properly equipped state operative would also have been provided with a small number of forged passports of high quality, not a collection of aliases to be cycled through on hotel check-in forms, while presumably showing the same underlying travel document. The Isdal Woman must have had valid travel documents to enter Norway, but only a damaged plastic passport cover was found at the scene. If she destroyed them herself, the destruction was very thorough. If someone else removed them from the scene, that is a different kind of answer entirely. Vasiliev's conclusion, shared by other analysts who have examined the case, was that she almost certainly was not a full field officer for a state intelligence service. What she might have been, he suggested, was a courier. In the pre-digital era, intelligence networks depended heavily on human couriers to physically carry documents, microfilm, money, forged identity papers, weapons, and technical specifications between handlers and operatives. A courier's job required movement, not stability. They did not need to build long-term local relationships. Their cover required transit, not embedding. A courier could naturally cycle through multiple identities to prevent any single surveillance system from tracking the full journey. A courier would carry cash from multiple countries. A courier would maintain a coded travel log recording movements. A courier would move through the major cities of Europe, Paris, Hamburg, Basel, Rome, that appear in what can be reconstructed of her itinerary. The courier hypothesis fits the behavioral evidence better than the field officer hypothesis. But if she was a courier, the question the theory has to answer is the one it most obviously raises. Who killed her and why? Couriers become liabilities in specific circumstances. If she had been identified by a hostile intelligence service, if the Penguin missile connection had been noticed, if she had been surveilled and her network was now exposed, her handlers would have had strong reason to silence her before she could be captured and interrogated. A courier who is rolled up by counterintelligence is the worst outcome for the network above her, because she knows routes, drop points, faces, and schedules. The value of eliminating her before that happened would have been considerable. Alternatively, if she had been identified not by her own side, but by a hostile one, the fire in the valley may have been the work of Western counterintelligence, a Norwegian, British, or American operation that had tracked her movement along the missile test route and decided that a quiet disposal was preferable to a public arrest that would force an awkward diplomatic confrontation. Norway's particular Cold War position, its need not to provoke Moscow while remaining committed to NATO, gave its security services reason to prefer informal resolution to formal ones. Either way, the courier theory does not point toward suicide. It points toward a woman who knew something, or had seen something, or had become traceable in a way that made her dangerous to someone with the means and motive to act. The silence of the Norwegian security apparatus after her death, the parallel investigations, the compartmentalization, the rapid closure, fits that reading. The Palestinian militant connection. In June 2023, the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Zeitung published an article that introduced a startling possibility. The piece described the work of a professional fact-checker who had spent years researching the case independently, and whose findings the newspaper investigated and found credible. The fact-checker's research led her to a man named François Junot. Junot was one of the most extraordinary and disturbing figures in post-war European history. Born in Lausanne, Switzerland, in October 1915, he had encountered Adolf Hitler as a young man traveling in Germany in the 1930s and had become a committed National Socialist who remained true to that commitment for the rest of his long life. He told a London newspaper in 1992, when he was 77 years old, that his views had not changed, that Hitler had been a great leader, and that the world would be a better place had Germany won the war. He died by his own hand in 1996 at the age of 80, having said that he did not want to live long enough for his body to fail him. What made Junot more than an aging ideological relic was that he was also a sophisticated and well-connected financial operator. He had substantial funds at his disposal, and he used them with purpose. Through his management of a private bank in Geneva, he accumulated and deployed money on behalf of what remained of the Nazi network after the war, funding the escape routes used by SS officers and war criminals fleeing Europe. He funded the legal defenses of prominent Nazi defendants, Adolf Eichmann, Klaus Barbie, and others. He paid the controversial French lawyer Jacques Verger, who would later defend some of the most notorious figures in European terrorism, to represent captured Palestinian militants in European courts. When 4 PFLP, or Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, operatives attacked an LL aircraft on the ground in Zurich in February 1969, killing the co-pilot and wounding passengers, Junot paid for the defense and sent money to the families of the attackers. He then sat next to Verger during the subsequent trial, which was held in Geneva, making no attempt to conceal his presence or his allegiance. There is another detail about Junot. During the Second World War, he had largely lived in Belgium. His wartime networks and his post-war financial connections ran through Brussels and the surrounding region. Belgium was not incidental to his story, it was central to it. From the late 1960s onward, Junot was enmeshed with the Palestinian militant movement. By the late 1960s, he had become close to George Habash and Wadi Haddad, the co-founders of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The PFLP had pulled off the first armed airline hijacking in July 1968, diverting an LL flight from Rome to Algiers and holding Israeli passengers for months. Junot paid Verger to defend the captured operatives. He became so trusted within Haddad's inner circle that Haddad gave him a nickname, Sheikh Francois. According to declassified CIA surveillance files, Junot had become Haddad's strategic advisor. He moved money into operations. He connected people. He was functionally the financial and logistical backbone of one of the most operationally active militant networks in the world. In October 1969, the year before the Isdal Woman's death, Junot met Haddad in Beirut to discuss future operations. Then, in late June 1970, Swiss federal police surveillance records show Gounod in Paris. He was there on June 26th and 27th, having traveled to meet Haddad again, who had entered France under a false identity undetected by French intelligence. They met, Gounod later told his biographer Pierre Pion, at the corner of Port de Malo and Avenue des Malakoff in the 17th arrondissement. Gounod then traveled briefly to Beirut before returning to Paris again in early July. September 1970, just weeks after these Paris meetings, saw Haddad's network execute the simultaneous hijacking of 4 airliners at Dawson's Field in Jordan, one of the most audacious militant operations in the history of aviation. 3 planes were destroyed on the ground after their passengers were evacuated. A 4th, an LL flight, had been foiled midair. The simultaneous actions triggered a crisis that changed the entire regional balance of power, forced the LPO, Palestinian Liberation Organization's expulsion from Jordan, and introduced a new era of international militant activity with European capitals increasingly as operational theaters. The Isdal Woman's coded travelogue shows her in Paris during the same summer that Gounod was there meeting Haddad. 2 people, both moving through Paris with false documents in the same week. One, a known financier and strategic advisor for Palestinian military operations. The other, an unidentified European woman with multiple false identities, a coded travelogue, cash from 3 different countries, and a mitochondrial haplogroup suggesting Southeastern European ancestry, consistent with the Balkans, the world from which the PFLP was drawing a large proportion of its European network. The theory, as reported by NZZ, is that the Isdal Woman may have been connected to Gounod's network, a courier or operative within the Palestinian militant infrastructure he was supporting. If true, her presence in Norway in 1970 takes on a different character entirely. Norway, with its NATO membership, its military installations, its strategic coastal geography, and its proximity to Soviet territory, would have been a location of interest to multiple parties in the autumn of 1970. And a woman moving through its coastal cities near classified military tests, connected to an international militant network, would have been of intense interest to Israeli intelligence. The Mossad's operations against Palestinian militants in Europe during this period are well documented. Operation Wrath of God, launched after the Munich massacre of 1972, was the most famous, but Israeli intelligence had been targeting PFLP operatives and their supporters across Europe since the late 1960s. A woman connected to the Gounod-Haddad network traveling through Scandinavia in autumn 1970 would have been a target. The NZZ article further alleged that the Norwegian intelligence service had actively worked to prevent local police from pursuing certain lines of inquiry, an allegation grounded partly in the already documented fact that the military had run a parallel secret investigation, partly in the Bergen police's own later admissions that they had been kept in the dark, and partly in the anonymous account of the hiker who was told to forget her. None of this amounts to proof of deliberate suppression, but together the pattern is harder to dismiss than any single piece of it would be alone. If the service had known or suspected the woman's death was connected to a Palestinian militant network touching Norwegian soil, the motivation to keep it away from local police would have been considerable. It would also have served multiple interests simultaneously: Norwegian, Israeli, and possibly American. The overlap in Paris is documented. Documented overlap is not documented contact, but it is a lead of the most explosive kind, and it sits unresolved. The sex worker theory. The newspapers in Norway initially referred to the Isdal Woman as Mademoiselle L, a placeholder that carried a particular implication. From the earliest days of the investigation, some of the Bergen police had privately harbored the theory that she might be a sex worker, though this had not been publicly stated as a serious investigative hypothesis until Norwegian author Dennis Sacher Aski published his book in 2018 and laid out the case for it in systematic detail. Aski's argument rested on behavioral evidence that, when assembled, points consistently in one direction. Her travel pattern, when mapped carefully, was not the scattered wandering of a tourist or the targeted movement of a spy. It was circular, always returning to certain hub cities, with Brussels as what Aski identified as her likely home base. In 1970, Brussels was home to one of the largest and most active sex industry networks in Western Europe, drawing workers from across the continent and serving an international clientele that included the large diplomatic and bureaucratic population associated with NATO headquarters, which had relocated to Brussels in 1967. High-end escort operations ran circuits through the major cities of Northern Europe: Bergen, Oslo, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Paris. A woman working within such a network would produce exactly this kind of itinerary: periodic circuits from a base city, hotel stays in each destination, cash transactions, and a return. She was, in every witness account, seeing with men and never with women. Her income source was unknown but sufficient to fund her hotel stays, her clothing, and her extensive travel. She was committed to anonymity in ways entirely consistent with someone in an industry where anonymity was both practically necessary and legally prudent. The men she encountered across her Norwegian travels never came forward, despite the publicity of the investigation. Men who had engaged the services of a sex worker would have strong reasons to remain invisible, particularly if her death had occurred in circumstances that could implicate them. Aski also noted a specific behavioral detail drawn from the original hotel staff testimony. At the Hotel Hordeheimen, staff observed that she placed a chair outside her room door when she left and brought it back inside when she returned, a method of knowing on return whether anyone had entered in her absence. Whether she did this at other hotels is not confirmed in the record, but the Hordeheimen observation was specific enough that staff mentioned it to investigators. Aski interpreted it as a practice documented among sex workers of the era who needed to know whether their space had been entered, a simple security measure for someone in a profession that carried significant personal risk. The non-prescription glasses, the wigs, the altered appearance across different encounters, all of these are consistent with professional operating in an industry where it was advantageous not to be easily recognized from one meeting to the next. The man from Forbach, who came forward in 2019 and said he had had a relationship with her in the summer of 1970, added a detail that has particular relevance here. He said that one day, while she was out, he had gone through her personal belongings. He found the wigs and the changes of clothing. He found documents she had not shown him. He was not entirely surprised. He had suspected she was not what she presented herself to be. He had suspected she was a spy, but the things he found in her bag, the multiple prepared disguises, the rotating wardrobe, were also entirely consistent with what Askey described, a woman who maintained different presentations for different contexts. Askey's most important argument was about the death itself. The physical evidence at the scene strongly suggested that someone else was present when she died. If she had been with a client whose identity was never established, and if something went wrong, and the client panicked and attempted to destroy the evidence, the scene would look very much like what was found. The removal of labels, the arrangement of objects, the fire. These could represent an attempt to eliminate any trace that would lead back to the person who had been with her. Askey concluded that her death was most likely murder, and that the nature of the relationship that ended in that death was precisely why the case proved so difficult to resolve. Nobody who knew the truth had any incentive to tell it. The sex worker theory is not incompatible with the espionage theory. People in the sex industry have historically been recruited into intelligence or criminal networks as couriers or informants for exactly the reasons Askey identifies. They were mobile, operated in cash, were experienced at maintaining multiple identities, and were socially positioned in ways that made them simultaneously useful to handlers and disposable. The organized crime and smuggling theory. A fourth framework, less developed in the public literature, but not without its advocates, is that the Isdal Woman was connected to organized crime rather than state intelligence or militant networks. The most specific version of this theory involves art smuggling. The 1960s and early 1970s were an active era for the theft and illicit trade of European artworks. Nazi looting during the war had displaced an enormous quantity of art, and the decades after 1945 saw a parallel shadow economy emerge around the recovery, sale, and resale of works whose provenance was unclear or actively concealed. Norway's coastal churches, particularly in the Bergen region, held medieval art and artifacts of considerable value. Maps found in the Isdal Woman's possession had markings on them, and some researchers have noted that the locations marked appear to correspond not to military installations, but to hilltop and coastal sites where historic buildings stood. One detail from the Death in Ice Valley podcast drew particular attention in this context. A witness described her as carrying a cylindrical canister during at least one encounter. The canister was initially described as hairspray, a mundane enough object, but a cardboard or aluminum tube of the type used to transport rolled documents or maps, or more significantly, to transport rolled canvases, what looks similar to hairspray canister to a casual observer. Some amateur researchers have built the case that her Norwegian itinerary followed a circuit of church locations with valuable medieval art, and that her connection to the Belgian art market, referenced in her cover story as in antiquity dealers, was not entirely fictional, but rather a thin disguise for something more dangerous. This theory has less documented support than the others, but it is worth noting that it is not incompatible with the spy or courier theories. Intelligence services of the era were enmeshed with the art market, using it as a channel for moving money and as cover for operatives who needed a plausible reason to travel, to cross borders, and to be found in possession of foreign currency and international contacts. An operative who was also an art smuggler, or a smuggler who was also a courier, would not be a strange hybrid in the world of 1970. The disturbed individual theory. There is a simpler sadder reading of the evidence, the possibility that the Isdal woman was not a spy, not a criminal operative, not a sex worker, but someone suffering from serious mental illness, whose multiple identities and coded movements were not professional tradecraft, but the compulsive behavior of someone managing a profound psychiatric condition, and whose death was ultimately a suicide, however elaborate the circumstances. The police closed the case as suicide, and there are details that could be read that way. A woman who travels constantly under multiple names with wigs and disguises, who pays only cash and marks her hotel room doors and keeps a coded diary. This could be paranoia. But the reading does not survive contact with the physical evidence. The systematic removal of every identifying label from every item she owned is not the behavior of a disorganized mind. It is the behavior of someone following a procedure. The consistency of her Belgian cover identity across 8 different aliases, across multiple countries, over months, suggests sustained rational planning that is not consistent with the disorganization of severe psychosis. In the scene of her death, the petrol, the placement of the hat beneath the body, the incapacitation before the fire, requires a physical presence in a deliberate sequence of actions that does not cohere around a lone actor in the grip of mental illness. The simplest reading and the most plausible reading are not, in this case, the same thing. Chapter 8. The Witnesses in the Silence. Beyond the physical evidence and the forensic science, there is a body of witness testimony that has accumulated across the decades, some gathered at the time, some emerging only years or decades later, as people came forward with things they had seen and never quite been able to let go of. A hotel maid at the Neptun Hotel overheard the Isdal woman speaking on the telephone in German, saying, "I'm coming soon." The maid gave this account to investigators at the time of the original inquiry. To whom she was coming and where was never established. Another staff member at the same hotel, a young waitress named Alvhild Rangnes, who was 21 at the time, remembered seeing her with an older gentleman who had white hair. They sat together at dinner and hardly spoke to each other. Rangnes described the atmosphere between them as cold, like people fulfilling an arrangement rather than enjoying each other's company. She came forward during the original 1970 investigation, and again when NRK reopened the case decades later. The white-haired man has never been identified. Another witness who came forward during the renewed investigation after 2016 described seeing the Isdal woman in a Bergen shop with a man. The two of them were arguing in what the witness believed was an Eastern European language, not German and not French, but something that seemed to come from further east. They were arguing about a standing mirror displayed in the shop. The man seemed to want to purchase it. The woman seemed to want him not to. A mundane domestic kind of disagreement in the middle of a mystery with no mundane explanation. The man has never been found. One of the most haunting accounts came from a Bergen resident who was 20 years old in November 1970. He stayed silent for 35 years before finally telling his story to local newspaper in 2005. He had been hiking on the slopes of Florian, the mountain on the western side of Bergen, 5 days before the body was found. He had encountered a woman on the trail who was dressed for the city, not for hiking. No proper outdoor clothing, no gear. She was walking ahead of 2 men in heavy overcoats who had, in his description, a southern appearance, Mediterranean or perhaps Middle Eastern. The woman walked slightly apart from the 2 men. He had the impression she was not there entirely by choice. As he passed her on the trail, she looked at him. She opened her mouth. She seemed, in that moment, as if she were about to say something to a stranger on a mountain path that might have changed everything. And then she did not speak. He walked on. He went to a contact at the Bergen police to report this and was told, according to his own account given to the newspaper in 2005, "Forget her. She's been seen to. The case will never be solved." No record of his sighting was ever made in the official investigative file. The exchange itself exists only in his testimony, which is precisely what makes it impossible to verify and impossible to dismiss. Then there's the taxi driver. We know a taxi was called for the Isdal Woman when she checked out of the Hotel Horteheimen in November 23rd, because hotel staff recalled it and told investigators at the time. Bergen had numerous taxi firms in 1970, and no centralized dispatch record that could be traced. Then, in 1991, a full 21 years after the fact, someone came forward anonymously to say they had been that driver. What this person said was crucial. After picking up the woman at the hotel, a second person had joined them for the ride to Bergen railway station, a man. The driver could not or would not identify him further, chose to remain anonymous, and has never been publicly named. A woman, a man, in a taxi to the train station, and then 6 days of silence before her body appeared on the hillside above the city. Chapter 9. The Burial, the Reopening, and What Science Has Given Us. On February 5, 1971, the woman who had called herself Genevieve Lancier and Claudia Tilt and Alexandria Zarna Merches, and 6 other names, was buried in a cemetery in Bergen. The ceremony was Catholic. Investigators based this on 2 things found in her suitcases: a picture of the Madonna and Child, and the fact that several of her aliases used the names of Catholic saints: Genevieve, Claudia, Elizabeth. Neither detail proved her faith, but together they were enough for investigators to choose a Catholic rite over no ceremony at all. 16 members of the Bergen police force attended. No family, no friends, no one who recognized her. She was placed in a zinc coffin, the zinc chosen deliberately because it slows decomposition. The investigators, even as they closed the case, understood that they might need to come back, that future evidence or future technology might demand it. The grave was left unmarked. The ceremony was photographed in case relatives came forward later and needed documentation. They did not come forward. For more than 4 decades she lay there, in a city that knew her only by a valley name, unidentified, officially closed. When Merritt Highgraft succeeded in reopening the case in 2016, and when NRK and later BBC launched the podcast Death in Ice Valley, the response was substantial. The series attracted listeners across Europe and beyond, and the collaborative Facebook group the BBC established became a crowdsourcing operation with amateur investigators, genealogists, linguists, historians, and ordinary people contributing analysis and memory. Listeners identified the likely origin of a spoon found in the Isdal woman's luggage, a silver spoon with its monogram filed away, but with a distinctive design traceable to a specific region of Central Europe. Listeners tracked down old hotel records. Listeners contributed memories of European fashions of the early 1970s that helped date and localized items of her clothing. Listeners who spoke Flemish, German, French, and various Eastern European languages weighed in on the linguistic evidence. The isotope analysis had confirmed a childhood near Nuremberg. The DNA analysis had confirmed haplogroup age 24. Then, in 2019, a man from the town of Forbach in northeastern France came forward after reading an article in his local newspaper, which had covered the NRK and BBC investigation and published one of the reconstructed sketches of the woman's face. He recognized it. Forbach sits in the Moselle region, on the border with German Saarland, precisely the area that the isotope analysis and linguistic analysis had already identified as a likely region of connection. He said he had known the woman in the summer of 1970, the months before her death, and had had a relationship with her. He described her in ways that matched the record exactly: the multiple languages, the Balkan accent, the wigs and disguised appearance, the refusal to share personal information, the regular scheduled phone calls she received from abroad at fixed intervals. She had dressed to appear younger than she was. He said she had ridden horses, and that among her belongings, which he had gone through one day while she was out, he had found a photograph of her on horseback. He had suspected she was a spy and had kept the photograph. He eventually gave it to investigators. It showed a woman outdoors in casual clothing, looking into the camera with an expression that has been described by many people as impossible to read, relaxed or performing relaxation, or somewhere between the two. The photograph exists. It is the only image that may show the Isdal Woman alive, and it tells us nothing conclusive. As of the most recent updates, the Bergen police maintain an open file. The DNA profile obtained from her remains has been submitted to multiple international databases without a match. Forensic genealogists continue working with the available genetic material, applying techniques that require matching the unknown DNA against the DNA of family members who may have submitted samples to genealogy databases voluntarily. The probability of a match increases slowly year by year as more people from across Europe submit DNA samples to the services. Conclusion. There's a question that sits behind all the specific questions of this case. Why does this story persist? Why has it held attention for more than 50 years, drawing in journalists and forensic scientists and amateur investigators and podcast listeners across multiple countries and generations? Part of the answer is structural. The case has unusual density of detail. The coded notebook, the 8 names, the wigs, the burned body, the petrol, the soot in the lungs, the 12 pills in the dirt, the bruise on the neck. Every detail invites a theory, and the theories are specific in ways that touch on the most consequential currents of 20th century history: the Cold War, the Palestinian conflict, the Nazi aftermath, the espionage landscape that defined Europe in the 1960s and 70s. This is not a mystery that exists in a vacuum. It is a mystery rooted in the most important geopolitical drama of the modern era. But there is another part of the answer that is harder to articulate. The woman was someone. She had a life. She was born near Nuremberg around 1930, which means the Third Reich was the backdrop of her early childhood. She was a child of the most catastrophic period in European history. She moved westward at some point in her childhood or adolescence, into France or Franco-German border region. She received an education in French language environment. She learned German and Flemish, and probably other languages. She became, as an adult, someone who moved through Europe with 8 names in cash sewn into a lining, in a coded notebook, in a suitcase full of wigs. and she ended up in November of 1970, lying on her back on a hillside above a Norwegian city, in the cold, in a place called Death Valley, with petrol beneath her and soot in her lungs. What happened to her in those 40 years between birth and death? What were the events, the decisions, the encounters, the forces that transformed a child growing up in the shadow of a Nazi regime into the unnamed woman in Ice Valley? What was she running from, or running toward? Who did she love? Who did she work for? Was she afraid? Did she choose what happened to her, or was it chosen for her? These questions have no answers. They may never have answers, but they are questions about a real person, about a human life that passed through the world and left almost nothing traceable behind it. The search for her name is not merely a forensic exercise or a historical curiosity. It is an acknowledgement that every human being who passes through the world deserves to be known as a person, not as a case number, not as a valley name. She is buried in a cemetery in Bergen under a stone that reads, "Unknown woman, called the Isdal Woman, found 29/11/1970. A precise and honest inscription, a grave marker that tells you everything that is known and nothing that matters most. If you have information, if a family story, a lost relative, a memory matches anything in this account, the Bergen police file remains open. The case number is 134-70. She was found in the Ice Valley on November 29th, 1970. She is still waiting to be known."